What happens when a 68-year-old retired detective gets pulled into one last case that defies everything he thought he knew about human nature? My uncle just told me a story that will make you question whether some mysteries are meant to stay buried. I'm about to share something that happened to my Uncle Frank just 3 months ago. He's been retired from the Detroit Police Department for over a decade, spent 37 years working everything from petty theft to murder cases. This man has seen it all, or so he thought. What happened to him on a quiet Tuesday morning in his suburban neighborhood would shake his faith in the very foundation of detective work he'd built his entire career on. Uncle Frank always said that retirement was supposed to be simple. Wake up, drink coffee, read the paper, maybe work in his garden. After nearly 4 decades of chasing down leads, interviewing suspects, and piecing together the darkest puzzles of human behavior, he'd earned his peace. But as he's learned, and as you're about to discover, sometimes the most compelling mysteries find you when you least expect them. It started with a knock on his door at 7:30 in the morning. Not unusual for a neighborhood where everyone knows everyone, except this wasn't a neighbor. Standing on his porch was a woman he'd never seen before, probably in her mid-40s, well-dressed but visibly shaken. She introduced herself as Margaret Chen, and she needed help with something the police wouldn't take seriously. Now, Uncle Frank gets this a lot. Word travels in small communities, and when people discover there's a retired detective living next door, they tend to show up with their unsolved problems. Usually it's missing pets, suspicious neighbors, or family disputes that don't quite rise to the level of police intervention. He's learned to be polite but firm about his boundaries. But something about Margaret was different. The way she carried herself, the specific details she mentioned, the genuine fear in her eyes, it reminded him of victims he'd encountered during his most serious cases. Margaret explained that her teenage daughter, Sarah, had been receiving letters. Not emails, not texts, but actual handwritten letters delivered to their mailbox. The letters contained detailed information about Sarah's daily routine, her friends, her school schedule, even what she wore on specific days. The content wasn't explicitly threatening, but it was unnervingly personal and clearly indicated someone was watching her daughter closely. Uncle Frank's first instinct was to direct her to the police. Stalking cases, especially involving minors, are taken seriously by law enforcement. But Margaret had already tried that route. She'd filed reports, provided copies of the letters, even installed security cameras around her property. The police had been professional and thorough, but they'd found no evidence of criminal activity. The letters contained no direct threats, no explicit language, nothing that crossed the legal threshold for harassment or stalking charges. Here's where it gets interesting. Margaret pulled out copies of the letters she'd brought with her. Uncle Frank, despite his retirement, couldn't help but slip back into detective mode as he examined them. The handwriting was unusual, not just neat, but almost mechanically precise. The paper was standard, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. But the content was what caught his attention. The letters weren't written like typical stalker correspondence. They read more like observation reports, clinical and detached. They described Sarah's activities with an almost scientific precision. Subject departed residence at 7:42 a.m., wore blue denim jacket, carried red backpack, walked to bus stop with 2 female companions. The language was formal, methodical, completely devoid of the emotional undertones you'd expect from someone obsessed with a teenage girl. Uncle Frank had seen thousands of pieces of evidence in his career. He'd developed an instinct for recognizing patterns, for spotting the details that others missed. Something about these letters felt familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. The writing style, the format, the particular way information was presented. It triggered a memory he couldn't quite access. He told Margaret he'd think about it, but honestly, he wasn't sure there was much he could do that the police hadn't already attempted. However, something about the case nagged at him for the rest of the day. That evening, he found himself pulling out old case files from his basement storage, searching for something he couldn't quite name. The next morning, Margaret was back. This time, she brought something new, a letter that had arrived overnight. But this one was different. Instead of observing Sarah, it was addressed to Margaret directly, and it contained information that made Uncle Frank's blood run cold. The letter detailed Margaret's own daily routine, But more unsettling, it included information about her past that very few people could possibly know. The letter mentioned a car accident Margaret had been involved in 15 years earlier in another state. It referenced the exact time of the accident, the weather conditions, even the color of the car she'd been driving. But here's the thing, Arco. Margaret had never been in a car accident. The letter was describing an event that never happened, but with such specific detail that it felt real. Uncle Frank realized they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple stalking case. Someone wasn't just watching Margaret's family. They were constructing an elaborate fiction about their lives, creating false memories and fictitious events with disturbing precision. But why? What was the purpose of this elaborate psychological game? This is where Uncle Frank's decades of experience became invaluable. He'd encountered cases where perpetrators created false narratives, but usually for specific gains: insurance fraud, custody disputes, revenge scenarios. This felt different. There was no apparent motive, no clear objective, just an intricate web of surveillance and fabrication. He decided to conduct his own investigation. Uncle Frank began by mapping out the information in the letters, creating timelines and cross-referencing details. He contacted old colleagues who were still active in the department, asking them to run background checks and look for similar cases in their databases. What he discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The pattern of letters Margaret's family was receiving matched reports from 3 other families in different parts of the state. Each family had received similar correspondence, detailed observations mixed with fabricated events from their past. Each family had contacted police, and each case had been dismissed due to lack of actionable evidence. But when viewed together, the cases revealed a systematic operation that was far more sophisticated than individual harassment. Uncle Frank's investigation led him to a discovery that changed everything. The letters weren't coming from a single disturbed individual. They were part of a psychological experiment being conducted by a private research company. The company was studying how families respond to surveillance and disinformation, apparently as part of a broader research project into social media influence and information warfare. The revelation was staggering. Margaret's family, along with the other families, had been selected as unwitting test subjects. Their personal information had been gathered through data brokers and social media analysis. The fictional events described in the letters were carefully crafted psychological triggers designed to create anxiety, paranoia, and family tension. The researchers were studying how these fabricated narratives would affect family dynamics and decision-making processes. But here's the most disturbing part, our woes. The research was completely legal. The company had exploited loopholes in privacy laws and research ethics regulations. They weren't technically threatening anyone. They weren't breaking any specific laws. And they had created a legal framework that protected them from prosecution. The families were victims of an elaborate psychological experiment, but they had no legal recourse. Uncle Frank found himself facing a moral dilemma that his decades of police work hadn't prepared him for. He'd uncovered the truth, but the traditional tools of law enforcement were useless. The perpetrators were hiding behind corporate lawyers and research ethics boards. The victims were suffering real psychological harm, but the system designed to protect them was powerless to act. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Uncle Frank realized that his greatest asset wasn't his detective skills or his law enforcement connections. It was his understanding of human psychology and his ability to think like both the investigator and a perpetrator. He decided to turn the researchers' own methods against them. Working with Margaret and the other affected families, Uncle Frank developed a counter-strategy. Instead of trying to stop the letters through legal channels, they would use the letters as a communication medium. They began responding to the fictional narratives, creating their own elaborate stories that turned the psychological experiment into a collaborative fiction project. The family started treating the letters like a creative writing exercise. They would respond with their own detailed observations about fictional events, creating increasingly absurd and entertaining stories. Margaret's daughter, Sarah, instead of being traumatized by the surveillance, began looking forward to the letters as a creative challenge. The family turned their fear into amusement, their paranoia into play. The psychological researchers, who had been studying the family's responses to create anxiety and confusion, suddenly found themselves dealing with subjects who were enjoying the experience. The families were no longer victims. They had become active participants in a game they were determined to win. Uncle Frank's strategy worked better than he'd anticipated. The research company, faced with subjects who were no longer providing useful data, began to lose interest in the experiment. The letters became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. The families had defeated a sophisticated psychological operation, not through legal action or police intervention, but through creativity and collective resistance. But the story doesn't end there. Uncle Frank's investigation had uncovered something much larger than a single research project. The company conducting the experiment was part of a network of organizations engaged in similar activities. They were testing psychological manipulation techniques that could be used for political influence, marketing campaigns, and social control. The letters to Margaret's family were just one small part of a much larger operation. Uncle Frank realized that his accidental investigation had stumbled onto something that professional law enforcement agencies were struggling to understand and combat. The intersection of technology, psychology, and legal loopholes had created new forms of harassment and manipulation that existing laws couldn't address. His retirement case had revealed gaps in the system that were being exploited by sophisticated actors with questionable motives. The experience changed Uncle Frank's perspective on both his career and his retirement. He'd spent 37 years believing that the law was the primary tool for addressing criminal behavior. But his encounter with Margaret's case showed him that some of the most harmful activities operate in the spaces between laws, in the gray areas where traditional law enforcement can't reach. He began working with local community organizations to educate people about these new forms of psychological manipulation. He developed workshops for families to recognize when they're being targeted by disinformation campaigns or psychological experiments. He collaborated with privacy advocates to push for stronger regulations on data collection and research ethics. Uncle Frank's story illustrates something profound about the nature of modern crime and victimization. The most sophisticated threats we face today aren't necessarily illegal in the traditional sense. They're psychological, technological, and social. They exploit our trust, our privacy, and our assumption that certain boundaries exist to protect us. Margaret's family emerged from their experience stronger and more aware of the hidden vulnerabilities in their digital lives. They learned to recognize manipulation techniques, to verify information before accepting it as true, and to work together when facing unusual or threatening situations. They turned a traumatic experience into a learning opportunity that made them more resilient. The research company eventually shut down their psychological experiment program, but Uncle Frank knows that similar operations are still active. The techniques they developed are being refined and deployed by other organizations with various objectives. The battle between those who seek to manipulate and those who resist manipulation is ongoing. Uncle Frank's retirement hasn't been the quiet, peaceful experience he'd planned. Instead, he's found himself at the center of a new kind of detective work, one that requires understanding psychology, technology, and social dynamics in ways that traditional police training never covered. He's become an informal consultant for families dealing with similar situations, a bridge between old-school investigative methods and new-age psychological warfare. This story reveals something important about the challenges we all face in an age of information warfare and psychological manipulation. The tools being used to influence and control us are becoming more sophisticated, more subtle, and more difficult to detect. But as Uncle Frank and Margaret's family discovered, our best defense isn't necessarily legal or technological, it's psychological and social. The most effective resistance to manipulation comes from understanding, community, and creativity. When we recognize that we're being targeted, when we work together to understand the techniques being used against us, and when we respond with intelligence and humor rather than fear and isolation, we can turn the tables on those who seek to exploit us. Uncle Frank's experience also highlights the importance of not accepting the boundaries that others try to impose on us. When the police told Margaret there was nothing they could do, when the legal system provided no recourse, when the traditional channels for addressing harm were blocked, Uncle Frank found alternative approaches that were ultimately more effective than conventional law enforcement. His story is a reminder that sometimes the most important detective work happens outside official channels, in the spaces between institutions where individuals must rely on their own intelligence, creativity, and community connections to solve problems that the system can't or won't address. As Uncle Frank continues his retirement, he's learned that experience and wisdom don't become obsolete just because you leave your official position. The skills he developed over 37 years of police work, observation, analysis, pattern recognition, and understanding human behavior, are more valuable than ever in an age where the nature of crime and victimization is rapidly evolving. The case of Margaret's mysterious letters became a defining moment in Uncle Frank's retirement, proving that some mysteries are worth solving, not because they're officially assigned to you, but because they reveal important truths about the world we're living in and the challenges we all face in protecting ourselves and our communities from those who would exploit our trust and vulnerability.